Tremendous pleasure to be here, my first time down under, and wonderful to see you all. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to talk to you today about how to be a pragmatist. And you might have noticed I'm called the John Dewey Professor. I'm a great admirer of Dewey, so how did I manage to get that title? And the answer is that at the University of Michigan, you get to choose your title because you don't have to name it after some rich person who donated a lot of money. The only constraint at University of Michigan is the name you give has to be somebody who once taught at University of Michigan. And John Dewey did. That's where he started his career. And I've spent many years reading Dewey very closely and realized that you have to slog through about 600 pages of pre-analytic prose to figure out what's going on. And most people don't have the patience for that. And so I decided one of the things I wanted to do was to recast Dewey-style pragmatism in terms that contemporaries can understand, and also think about how to advance pragmatist moral epistemology in conjunction with knowledge that we now have about how to work in conjunction with cognitive sciences, social psychology, and so forth, to improve the way we think about ethics. So I'm just going to give you a little sense, a taste of what this project is about. There's much, much more to it. So we'll just start off asking the question, what is pragmatism in ethics? And you might have heard people say, well, pragmatists just say, they recommend do what works. And this seems a profoundly unsatisfactory piece of advice. Because pragmatists resolutely refuse to provide a substantive criterion of what works. So what I'm going to be doing in this talk is to explain why pragmatists resist providing such a substantive criterion of what works, but how, nevertheless, once you understand what that phrase really comes to, you can see that it can do some work for us. Okay, so although it may seem to be empty and useless advice, by the end of this lecture, I think you will find otherwise. Here's the key idea. The central idea of pragmatism in ethics is to replace the quest for a fundamental principle of morals, the quest to find out whether something like the categorical imperative or the principle of utility or the golden rule, we have different moral theories about what the fundamental foundational principle of ethics is. Pragmatists say, stop doing that. Instead, we should seek methods for intelligently updating the moral beliefs that we currently have. So it replaces a foundational quest with a set of methods for intelligently updating our current moral beliefs. Now let's think about how that might be cashed out in practice. And what I want to do here is to contrast dominant methods in moral philosophy with pragmatist methods. So a key dominant method is to use intuition and a priori reasoning to seek fundamental principles of morality. Pragmatists, by contrast, seek empirically grounded methods to intelligently update our moral beliefs. Stress here is on empirically grounded. We actually need to look at how people do think about their moral decisions and how we can improve the ways we actually think about the moral problems that confront us. Dominant methods involve seeking some kind of systematic unifying principles that are true ultimately in all possible worlds, something like the categorical imperative or the principle of utility. Whereas pragmatist methods seek no more generality than is required for the actual problems we face or the problems we're likely to face. Dominant methods in moral philosophy pay limited and superficial attention to moral bias. So it's pretty commonplace for people to recognize that people tend to be biased in their own case, and in response to that, to look for some way to get more impartial ways of reasoning. But it's a very limited kind of inquiry, and rarely is it actually empirically grounded in knowledge of how to actually overcome such biases. Since we could think that we're adopting an impartial point of view, when in fact the point of view we adopt can be filled with all kinds of implicit biases of which we're unaware, whereas pragmatists, in fact, take as a central subject of inquiry the psychological and social causes of bias without assuming that we can detect them just from introspection or adopt any easy or simple methods for blocking their operation. In fact, it takes a lot of scientific inquiry to figure out, to identify biases and to figure out how to counteract them. Dominant methods tend to sharply separate facts from values, with the ultimate objective, in many cases, of finding fact-free moral principles. You can see an excellent example of that point of view, both in Kant's philosophy and much more recently in Jerry Cohen's famous essay on facts and principles. Whereas by contrast, pragmatist methods focus on how we can test our moral principles empirically in practice. So from a pragmatist point of view, moral thinking is of a piece with any kind of ordinary inquiry, intelligent inquiry into the world, of a piece with scientific inquiry. And so we can improve our modes of moral inquiry just as we use empirical methods to improve scientific inquiry. So to get some sense of how we might go about doing that, we should first off think about what normative intuitions are. Okay, we cannot proceed ethically without relying on normative intuitions. And here I'm not drawing a sharp distinction between intuitions about particular cases, such as an intuition that this particular lie told to a particular person is wrong, and intuitions of a more general nature, the idea that lying is generally morally objectionable and it would take something really big to justify it. Okay, both of those I'm calling normative intuitions. And let's just think a little bit naturalistically about what normative intuitions are. Okay, and we can take what I'll call the standard case in which a normative intuition arises, and the standard case is deliberation. Okay, we're wondering what to do. And what deliberation is a thought experiment, right? The occasion of deliberation is that we need to act, but we have doubt about what to do. And so we pose to ourselves various alternative possible actions that we have before us in our heads, okay? And what we do is we imagine what it would be like to perform that act and what we expect the consequences of different options, of different actions would be, okay? And then, very importantly, we don't just imagine what the objective consequences of the behavior would be, but we also simulate our moral reactions, both to the acts and to their consequences. We imagine, okay, like, would I find acting in a certain way morally repugnant? Would I find the consequences of this action appalling? Okay, those are moral reactions. And those are what our intuitions are, what they fundamentally consist in, are kind of moral reactions to our thinking about acting in certain ways and our expectations of what the consequences would be. Now, in the case of deliberation, importantly, we undertake this thought experiment with the intention to act as our intuitions direct, right? We'll test various scenarios, action scenarios, and their consequences in a thought experiment, find out how what our intuitions are about whether it be good or bad, right or wrong to act in these ways. And then hopefully at the end of this, we will come to a settled conclusion about which action would be best, or perhaps just whether a particular action would be morally objectionable, with the intention of actually following the guidance that our intuitions offer. So that's where intuitions in the standard case come from, and that's how we use them. But then we have intuitions that arise in philosophical thought experiments, like the famous trolley cases, where we ask ourselves, should I push the fat man onto the trolley track in the expectation that his mass would stop the trolley from running over and killing additional people, okay? So that's a pretty standard kind of philosophical thought experiment. What I want to argue here is that the intuitions elicited in these thought experiments are not insights into necessary truths, and no amount of speculation will get us anything close to that. Rather, the intuitions elicited in philosophical thought experiments are nothing more than the conclusions of simulated deliberation, right? We imagine ourselves in the position of the potential pusher in this case, and we simulate the deliberations that we think such a potential pusher would have to go through in order to decide whether or not to push the fat man onto the trolley track, okay? So in this simulated deliberation, we forecast the consequences of pushing the fat man, and we also simulate valuations of those consequences and also of the act itself. And those are largely emotional responses. Again, we consider whether the act of pushing would be felt as repugnant, whether the consequences of pushing would be something welcomed or something one finds awful, okay? That's the source of our normative intuitions in this case. But the difference between a philosophical thought experiment and the standard case, where we get intuitions from actual deliberation, is that in this case, we engage in a philosophical thought experiment without the intention to act as the intuitions direct, since we're not actually in the situation that we're imagining. We don't actually have stakes in answering the question. And consequently, the intuitions evoked in philosophical thought experiments are, frankly, less serious than what we get in deliberation, less serious even than in planning. Okay, so let's consider some implications of this naturalistic picture about intuitions, philosophical intuitions, normative intuitions. Here, I think, are some implications. One is that intuitions in philosophical thought experiments are no more reliable than actual deliberation, because all we're doing is simulating deliberation. So simulating a process can't get us more reliable results than actually undertaking the process for real. In fact, intuitions in philosophical thought experiments are subject to the very same errors and biases that we're subject to in actual deliberation. If we consider the limits of deliberation, It's pretty clear we're better at deliberating about familiar circumstances, and deliberation is less reliable the further removed we are, our situation is, from current circumstances that we've already had long experience with. And that should suggest to us that bizarre thought experiments, the intuitions elicited in bizarre thought experiments, really aren't that reliable. We don't have much reason to trust them. I'm not saying we don't have such intuitions. What I'm suggesting, though, is maybe we shouldn't give them a whole lot of credence. Indeed, I think probably these intuitions are less reliable than deliberation, precisely because they are undertaken without a great degree of seriousness, and they tend to be more removed from experience. So what I'm suggesting then is, okay, we should really be thinking about an alternative method of moral thinking, something that's more serious and more reliable. And that's what leads us to the pragmatist alternative. So just to remind you, pragmatists say we should abandon the quest for a fundamental principle of morality that's supposedly true in all possible worlds. We're unlikely to arrive at any such principle in any reliable fashion. And even if we were to get it, it wouldn't necessarily be all that helpful to us in resolving any particular moral problem that we have, because all of the uncertainties would then erupt at the stage of application. So that suggests that we should downplay the a priori methods upon which philosophers are so reliant, the kinds of methods we undertake around the seminar table or just thinking in our heads, pure thought experiments. And instead, we should replace that quest with the search for methods of intelligent updating of our current intuitions. We start off with some moral beliefs, call them intuitions, and think about, okay, how can we improve the way we're thinking about our moral problems in order to more effectively address the moral problems that we're actually facing? So again, I just want us to think in a common sense way about how, in fact, we do judge the reliability of intuitions. And my suggestion is that we judge the reliability of intuitions through actual experiments in living, not just thought experiments in our heads. More fundamentally, we test our moral beliefs through actual experiments in living. That is, we have a moral intuition, a moral judgment that some mode of conduct is correct and some other mode of conduct is wrong, and we act in accordance with these moral beliefs. And we see what the consequences are in reality, right? We confront the actual consequences of acting in accordance with the moral principles that we believe in. And we also study our actual moral reactions, our own personal moral reactions and the reactions of others to our act and its consequences. Here is a beautiful photograph here of somebody who really is feeling regret or remorse, right? Regret and remorse have genuine epistemic value, right? It's signaling to us, wow, this thing I thought would be a good idea, this act, didn't turn out the way I thought. Right? It's signaling these emotions are powerful epistemic signals of moral error. Okay? And so then you do something, you find out perhaps that other people react in surprising and distressing ways to your conduct, or perhaps you find that you yourself are horrified by your conduct, even though it was in accordance with what you had up till then believed. Or maybe you just find some surprising consequences, objective consequences of the act that you didn't realize before. And it gets you to thinking, wow, what did I do wrong? What went wrong here? Okay? So I'm focusing here on what I'll call epistemically informative moral reactions. These are things like regret, remorse, shame, guilt, anger. This is usually the anger of other people, people angry at you for the way you behaved. Right? These are the kinds of emotions that signal the need to rethink. Okay? It's not to say that these emotions are infallible. Sometimes they misfire. But most of the time, if you're feeling these emotions, it's time to start restudying the moral beliefs that led you to this action and its consequences to see what went wrong. So what I'm focusing here on is on surprising negative consequences of one's action, surprising reactions, moral reactions to that, because those are signs, not infallible signs, but signs that the original intuitions on which we acted are erroneous and give us reasons perhaps to revise, to rethink. Okay, probably something went wrong here with my moral beliefs. Maybe it's time to revise them. And you can imagine this woman here full of remorse and regret is thinking not just, what did I do wrong in this particular case? How should I revise my first order principle of conduct? But she might also be thinking, well, you know, there was something wrong with my mental processes here, right? Maybe I can also reflect about flaws in my general deliberative strategy. Maybe what happened was, for instance, that I failed to take account of the interests of some whole class of people who now are very angry at me for doing something that trampled on their interests. And then I should think, okay, like, why did I neglect their interests? Maybe I should then revise my deliberative processes so that next time I will take account of their interests, right? And that would be a kind of higher order thinking to improve our methods of moral reflection. So this leads to our fundamental pragmatist methods then. What we want to do is find ways to intelligently update the intuitions that we discover are erroneous on the basis, or at least problematic, on the basis of actual experiments in living, on the basis of actual conduct in accordance with those moral intuitions, moral beliefs, moral principles, right, that had surprising negative consequences. Okay? And so now I'm going to outline a series of steps. Number one, we should focus on the conditions that are prompting moral reconsideration. These are problematic situations and experiences that can include things such as unresolved interpersonal conflict. You know, all these people are angry at you or resisting what you're trying to do. Sometimes problems arise because of new or newly recognized bad consequences of following a norm. A norm here is just a moral belief that's embodied in social practices that people expect that other people and themselves to obey. And these kinds of problematic situations and experiences lead to uncertainty and disagreement on how to proceed, okay? And then force us to reflect on the point of the current moral norm that one is acting on, okay? Maybe there was something wrong with our understanding of how to cope with the moral issue, and we have to rethink that. And so one way to think about pragmatism then is kind of like moral medicine, right? What you do is with these problematic situations, Now you realize, wow, I thought I knew how to cope with this situation, but I see that I really didn't because I got into trouble in various ways. And so now we have to go back and do some diagnosis. So, right, like a moral doctor, we provisionally diagnose the moral problem that has to be solved. Okay? It's only a provisional diagnosis, just like in medicine. You could start off thinking that, maybe this patient, on the basis of these symptoms, has cancer, and then you test further and find out, well, it's actually something else going on, and that's possible in morality as well. But in any event, we start with the negative experiences and complaints of people, including oneself, to the conduct in question. But most of the need for revision is coming from the negative experiences of those who are suffering or discontented with the conduct which up till now has been thought to be okay. And again, the stress here is on the epistemic value of the actual problems of actual people, right? And a stress on the idea that those have greater epistemic value than the hypothetical problems of hypothetical people. Thirdly, pragmatists then say we should reflect on the deficiencies of our current moral norms, the current beliefs that we are practicing in that coordinate our behavior. These are just moral intuitions that are embodied in social practice. And we reflect on the deficiencies of those norms for coping with the current problem. Okay? Here, I want to focus on a naturalistic account of how current norms actually were formed and continue to be sustained. And maybe if we get a naturalistic account of how that happened, we can detect some difficulties, right? It might be that, in fact, an investigation into our current norms will discover that they, in fact, were devised for different problems, or maybe for problems, for the same problem encountered under very different conditions. And so as conditions have changed, or as the problem has shifted a little bit, the old norm maybe no longer copes successfully with the problem. Or perhaps on a naturalistic account, we could find that action on a certain norm was undertaken without awareness or appreciation of all the consequences, and all those complaints from other people is alerting us to various consequences that either we were unaware of before, or perhaps didn't fully appreciate how important those consequences are. And complaining, expressions of anger and outrage and so forth, shaming, these are ways that other people have of informing us that we haven't fully appreciated or given appropriate weight to certain negative consequences of our conduct. Fourthly, we can reflect on what went wrong with our intuition formation. And here I just want to put this in terms that maybe are closer to the way cognitive and social psychologists and other social scientists think about it. We could think about what biases or oversights led to our original erroneous moral belief. And now we have huge realms of psychology in particular that investigates biases. So for instance, we have in-group, out-group bias. Turns out that for completely arbitrary reasons, this is very well studied, and it's absolutely pervasive. Take random people, give half of them blue ribbons, half of them green ribbons, put them in public goods experiments or other experiments that require cooperation. You find out people, total strangers, if they have the same color ribbon, they're much more cooperative and nice to each other than they are to people with the other color ribbon. Okay? There's no conceivable justification for this differential behavior. Just seems as if human beings, even if the group they're assigned is completely arbitrary and has no content or history or any kind of future, we still have an in-group bias. Okay? no way to justify it. On reflection, you can't see any rationale for that. Okay, and so if we find that error maybe was produced by some completely arbitrary bias like this, and we can tell from scientific investigation sometimes that that's what happened, then what you want to do is figure out ways to block the operation of that bias, right? And then after blocking that, you can rethink the problem, and that will give you some revised intuitions about how you ought to behave. So a lot of the work in pragmatist moral epistemology is to study both what kinds of biases we tend to be prone to under different circumstances, and secondly, to figure out ways to correct and block those biases so that we can engage in clearer moral thinking, more intelligent moral thinking. So an analogy that I like to use here is the way science has learned to improve itself through the study of biases in its own operations. And so a classic case here would be with the recognition of the problem of the placebo effect, where you're trying to test the effectiveness of some drug. But if people know, if patients know that they're actually taking the drug, they're hoping that it works. The scientists too, they have career stakes with the experiment turning out to be successful. So they also are really hoping that patients get better by taking the drug, and that leads to a known bias in people's reporting of symptoms. They feel better after getting the experimental drug. And the way to block the operation of that bias is to conduct a double-blind study where neither the experimenter nor the patient is aware of whether they're taking a sugar pill or some kind of placebo, or whether they're taking the actual drug of interest. And then you have figured out a way to block the operation of a certain bias, classic bias of wishful thinking on both sides. And so that gives us reason to believe that the outcome of a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial will be more reliable. Not that it will be perfect. In fact, we now have an enormous literature that has shown that clinical trials, there's enormous error rates in clinical trials. There's tons and tons of other biases that have not been effectively controlled for. There's publication bias and so forth. But once we can identify new biases, we can also figure out ways to block those biases and hopefully get even more reliable results. And my suggestion is we can do that in ethics just like we do it in science. All we need to do is to have more rigorous, empirically grounded investigations of how we actually are undertaking moral deliberations to tease out what those biases are. And then we can empirically investigate what actual practices could help us counteract or block the operation of those biases, with the expectation that having counteracted or blocked those biases, our subsequent moral thinking will be smarter. Not that it will be perfect, not that it will be error-free any more than the introduction of placebo controls and double-blind makes the outcomes of science infallible. It doesn't at all. It just makes it better. Okay, and we can do that for ethical thinking as well. Okay, so key thing then in pragmatist moral methods is bias correction techniques, studying moral bias, studying how to correct those biases. And the second thing is then we have come up then with what we take to be a better moral belief after undertaking bias correction methods. It's not the end of the story. We have to go back and test those revised beliefs by putting them in practice and evaluating the results in an actual experiment in living, not just in your head, but in the world. You act in accordance with your moral beliefs and see whether such action works in the sense of solving or helping us cope effectively with the moral problem as we originally diagnosed it. Okay, so we can ask, do these revised moral beliefs solve the problem as we diagnosed it back in stage 1 or 2 with acceptable side effects, right? It might cope with the problem in one sense, but then other surprising negative consequences arise that we have to deal with. Okay, and suppose we find out that our revised moral beliefs have surprising negative consequences when we put them into action, when we act in accordance with them. Well, then you rinse and repeat, right? And doing so may require us to go back to the drawing board and revise our original diagnosis. We didn't quite get it right, what our moral problem was. Okay, so we might have to undertake a new diagnosis, and we might also have to revise our evaluative criteria if the experienced valuation of outcomes is not the same as our prior evaluation. Maybe we even need new moral vocabulary, new moral concepts to really come to grips and help explain our untoward moral reactions. Okay? And here I want to focus on emotional responses. In practice, and inevitably, we use them as value detectors, right? And I'm stressing here the negative moral reactions, surprising negative moral reactions, things like regret, remorse, guilt, shame. Those tend to be pretty strong. As long as they're surprising, they tend to be indicators, wow, okay, there's something here to be learned that I didn't know before. However, at the same time, it doesn't mean that we treat them as infallible any more than we treat sense perception as infallible. Sense perception can be tricked under a variety of circumstances, so can our moral reactions. And so to refine our value detection mechanism, we also have to subject that to bias correction. So this seems really, really abstract, and I want to make it more concrete using a case study, which is something I've been studying for quite a long time now. And this is a real-life, society-wide change in moral beliefs. 300 years ago, you could find almost no one who believed that slavery was morally wrong. Today, it's an almost universal moral belief that slavery is wrong. There's no country in the world that accepts slavery as a legal institution. Okay? And in this lecture, I just want to focus on one small part of the problem, which is a set of biases that I think underwrote original support for the morality of slavery, for the idea that slavery is morally okay. And the biases I want to focus on are biases that arise as a result of social inequality. So I want to ask, how does social inequality alter moral thought? In other words, how does power and privilege bias people's thinking? And how can such biases be counteracted? And then how do our intuitions change when those biases are actually countered? Okay, so I just want to run through quickly some what I'll call power biases that are actually implicated in slavery. So I'll take two social psychologists here, Jennifer Steller and Paul Piff, who've done some very interesting experimental work on people's sympathy and how sympathy varies with social class position. So Steller has done some interesting work where she finds that the richer people are, the less of a sympathetic reaction they have to the suffering of others. Even physiologically, you can measure that. Paul Piff has done some interesting experiments that show that rich people are more likely to take candy from babies. Okay, so he has many other very amusing experiments of different sorts. Rich people are also more likely to violate the rights of way of pedestrians. Tons and tons of things like this. Seems that higher class individuals are less compassionate than lower class individuals, according to their study. And indeed, we find this bias absolutely evidenced in the pro-slavery literature. So I'll just draw an example from one major pro-slavery writer in the United States before the Civil War, who insisted that whipping is not degrading to a slave, nor does a slave find it degrading, right? And also insists that slaves didn't mind it so much when their family was broken up and sold to different plantations, okay? Now, we actually have evidence from their diaries that they really believed garbage like this. It's one thing just to sort of put it out as propaganda, but when they write this in their diary, they have no reason to lie to themselves, okay? But they're still saying stuff like this. So it seems to be a genuine bias, okay? Here's another one. This comes from Dewey. He identified arrogance as a source of moral bias of the powerful. He said, with his co-author James Tufts in a wonderful ethics textbook, which is still worth reading today, it's difficult for a person in a place of authoritative power to avoid supposing that what he wants is right, as long as he has power to enforce his demand. And even with the best will in the world, he's likely to be isolated from the real needs of others, and the perils of ignorance are added to those of selfishness. Here's another bias. I'm glad to have Sally in the room here. I see in many ways this lecture is simply a follow-on of her seminar earlier today. Sally identified a very important kind of power bias known as objectification, and this consists in viewing a social group in terms of its service to one's own desires, enforcing that view by placing the group in a subordinate role, and representing that group as inherently fit for that role and unfit for superior roles, okay? And we see exactly that objectification bias happening in justifications for slavery, right? Whites viewed blacks in terms of being good for menial labor and cash crop production that whites then would be able to sell and make a lot of money out of. They enforced that view of blacks through slavery, okay, putting them in a subordinate role. And then they represented blacks as inherently fit for slavery and unfit for freedom. And again, you see this argument all over the pro-slavery literature. Classic case, Senator James Henry Hammond in a speech before the United States Senate in 1858. His famous Mudsill speech, in which he argued that all social systems need to have a class of people who perform the drudgery of life, menial duties, and the South was lucky to have a race that was naturally fitted for such drudgery, an inferior race, and so forth, right? Classic expression of precisely the objectification bias that Sally identified. So once you identify certain biases of these sorts, you got to think, okay, what kinds of corrective social practices can we have that would counteract those biases? And okay, we have some diagnoses here. Lack of sympathy of the powerful. So maybe we can figure out practices that would inspire sympathy for subordinates, especially, to kind of get the powerful to start feeling some sympathy, to inform the powerful of the actual objective interests of the people who they are objectifying, right? That slaves actually object to being whipped and to having their families split apart, okay? Practices that will confront the power with experiences of accountability that spur practical reflection regarding subordinates' claims. Right? It's very easy for the powerful to just insulate themselves, right? But you have to make it a problem for them that slaves are oppressed, okay? And then they have to rethink, okay, can't continue the way we've been continuing, okay? Fourthly, to display the worthiness of the people complaining, to put authority behind their claims, okay? And I just want to say very briefly about what that would look like. In fact, I have a whole book which I elaborate on this in detail. Just want to focus on two elements of corrective practice in ethics. One is the active, practical collective contention against slavery. It wasn't enough just to make counterarguments. People had to take to the streets, okay, in deeds, not just in words, to challenge slavery. And secondly, essential to bias correction was the participation of slaves and free blacks in practices of contention. So just want to talk a little bit about what contentious politics consists in and why it can be a vehicle of moral learning. Okay, contention is just a practice of claim making, practical claim making. What you're doing is wrong, stop it, do this instead. Okay, contentious politics is a kind of coordinated contention by groups of people around a shared agenda that addresses authorities, challenges their authority to do what they're doing, and insists that they revise. Okay, and we can arrange modes of contention from less to more disruption of routines. So on the least contentious side, we have argument, moral argument, just pure moral argument. But then we can go all the way out to violence, right? And all kinds of steps in between. So closer to argument are things like mass petitions, op-eds, guerrilla theater, teach-ins, and so forth. But you can also, say, engage in litigation, election campaigns, lobbying, and demonstrations, a little bit more disruptive. Even more disruptive, you could have boycotts. Anti-slavery activists, for instance, boycotted sugar, which was produced by slaves, as a way to get the slave owners to think, maybe this isn't really a great way to make a lot of money. Picketing, strikes, sit-ins, things like this. And ultimately, vandalism, riots, rebellion, slaves rising up and saying, no more, we're not going to take it anymore. Okay? In my research on collective transformation of beliefs about the legitimacy of slavery, absolutely central and critical to this change was the participation of slaves and free blacks in practices of contention. So here we have an illustration of a very famous case, Frederick Douglass, one of the great abolitionist activists. A slave in Maryland was sent to Mr. Covey, who was a slave breaker. His job was to so physically demoralize recalcitrant slaves that they would accept their subordination and go back to being obedient slaves. And Douglass decided that he was going to beat Covey to a pulp, and he did. And remarkably, Covey then accepted. He backed down. And Douglass was never whipped again. Covey was afraid of him. Okay? And Douglass, in one of his autobiographies, said, I had reached the point at which I was not afraid to die, and this spirit made me a freeman in fact, while I remained a slave in form. When a slave cannot be flogged, he is more than half free. Okay, this is an example of individual resistance, but of course, in the overthrow of slavery in the United States, it took mass collective resistance. But this is just an interesting individual case that, of course, is repeated many times by many other slaves in resisting slavery. Another classic case is from Harriet Tubman. She successfully freed hundreds of slaves, helping them escape north. And Tubman herself, thinking in very similar lines to Douglass, reported, I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. That resource inside her to face up to and defy death in leading slaves to freedom. Okay? And that mass resistance was slaves themselves telling pro-slavery people don't for a moment think we don't mind whipping or that we don't mind our families being broken up and sold to different estates. We're telling you now we do mind. We do mind the exploitation and so forth, and that's why we're not taking it anymore. Okay? Another important case. How did the slaves acquire any kind of moral authority, given that pro-slavery thought took them to be virtually subhuman? We have an interesting case towards the end of the Civil War. The Confederacy is near collapse. They're running out of soldiers, and they have a debate. Okay, maybe we should just put our slaves in uniform and have them fight on our behalf. Okay, it might be a little delusional, okay, but in fact, Howell Cobb, one of the founders of the Confederacy, argued right towards the end of the war. Okay, he said, if slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. He said that. Well, the North did put escaped slaves and free blacks who had formerly been slaves into uniform. Here's an actual photograph of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the most famous black regiments in the Union Army. They fought with magnificent courage and skill, and by Cobb's own criteria, refuted their whole theory of slavery. Okay, so one of the deepest moral psychologists among the abolitionists was Frederick Douglass himself. Here's a photograph. And in My Bondage and My Freedom, he said, there's a very deep insight. Human nature is so constituted that it cannot honor a helpless man, although it can pity him. And even this it cannot do long if the signs of power do not arise. Douglass here is pointing to a moral bias that's deeply embedded in human psychology. Okay, if you can subordinate someone and they just sit back and take it, it's very hard to honor them, right? The way to overcome that moral bias is to resist and reject that oppression, okay? And it was the movement to abolish slavery, which in the United States required all forms of contention, from pure moral argument all the way up to violent forms of rebellion. Active, practical resistance, indeed, and not just in word, that was required, not just to overthrow slavery as a practice by force, but to change people's minds about what was right or wrong. So I want to stress here that although slavery was overthrown by force, it did not leave beliefs, moral beliefs about slavery intact. In fact, there was an incremental change in moral conviction, even on the part of former slaveholders. What was achieved in the post-emancipation world across the South was largely a sharecropping labor regime in which the freed people won a limited degree of autonomy. As economic historians, Ransom and such call it, one kind of freedom. It was far from a free labor regime, but it was way, way better than chattel slavery. And it turns out that the landlords themselves, after finally having experience with something better for the slaves, for their former slaves than slavery, ended up coming to acknowledge, yeah, you know, that is a better labor regime than slavery. Okay, it's an incremental change. It's far from what the slaves and the abolitionists wanted. It would be recognition of the full and equal moral standing of blacks. Nevertheless, it was a step forward. So what I'm trying to do then is to update the Pragmatist research program, bring it into contact with contemporary research in the social sciences about the kinds of biases to which our thinking is subject, including our moral thinking. Okay, and this is how I think we can replace the quest for an ultimate foundational principle of right with methods of intelligent updating, where the stress here is on empirical inquiry. We can work with the social sciences and with history to investigate biases in our moral thinking and practical methods for counteracting those biases. And here I stress methods in deed and not just in word. We philosophers have to acknowledge that although arguments have their role, moral arguments have their role, they are rarely sufficient to change minds without active contention on the ground of morally objectionable practices. And we need to investigate actual experiments in living, where people have actually put moral intuitions into practice and assess the results of those experiments and their import for our moral beliefs. So this, I think, gives us an understanding, then, to return to the original slide. What do pragmatists mean when they advise do what works? Okay, it's not empty. It seems empty because it resists telling you some substantive moral principle that supposedly solves all moral problems, because we don't have reliable access to such a thing, even if it did exist. Nevertheless, we are capable of formulating our challenges in terms of problems that need to be solved. And that helps us think about what empirically we would have to do in order to solve the problem as diagnosed. Okay, that's an empirical investigation. And it can be tested empirically by putting it into action, seeing what the results are, and seeing if we find those results morally acceptable. And if we don't, if we find ourselves appalled, outraged, full of regret and remorse and so forth, then we can rethink not only what we ought to do in this particular type of case, but also we can rethink how we thought about the problem originally. Criticize that. Think about what biases were affecting our original way of thinking about the problem. Think about what practices we can implement to counteract those biases. And that should help us think more clearly, more intelligently, more effectively about the moral problem before us. And that's a way of doing what works. Thank you. So that's really interesting. I originally wanted to be an economist. And when I was studying economics, I started noticing a lot of both conceptual and normative problems with economic theory, and realized that economists didn't really have good answers to those questions. But philosophers actually, like the philosophical tools, I thought gave us sort of a better handle on some of those both normative and conceptual difficulties. So then I thought, you know, we really have to think about the ways modern societies are so profoundly affected by economics and markets, and what goes wrong with our sort of market-dominated ways of thinking about society and social and political arrangements. And it was really, the desire to think through those issues that led me to philosophy and to make it something I really needed to dig in deep.